One of the other areas that was a really big issue for the League was the issue of married women and tax. The joy of tax resisting is it tended to be an annual thing, and it tended to happen in the summer, and once you'd had your distraint, you were free to spend a lot of the rest of the year doing other things. And one of the things that the League campaigned on particularly was this issue of married women and tax. And there was two particular concerns that they had. The first was the wording in the Income Tax 1842. So even though this is the 1900s, the Income Tax Act is 1842, which is when income tax came back in under Robert Peel, was still valid. And you'll observe, I'm not married, so I'm just like, well, those of you who are married will particularly observe that at that point you were classified with infants, lunatics, the idiots and the insane. And obviously this was an affront to educated, capable women who were holding down professional jobs. The second issue, and this was Athaleas Purdy's least favourite section of the Act, was although a married woman was taxable, it was deemed that any profits that she earned through self-employment were those of her husband, and it was the husband that paid the tax. And the issue here is because the Income Tax Act 1842 came in before the Married Women's Property Acts of the 1870s to 1890s. So in 1842, once you were married, you ceased to have a legal existence. You were no longer a femme sole, you were femme covert, and essentially you were just part of your husband. And he would look after all of the money and the taxes and deal with all of that. Following the 1870s and 1890s series of acts in which married women were able to first keep their own income that they earned during marriage and then ultimately retain assets from before the marriage and inherit assets, there was just this clash then between the Income Tax Act that had never been changed and the new later rights that women had through these Married Women's Property Acts. And this was a particular issue, and this was the kind of the section that Athaleas Purdy would go to town on and did a number of cases on. It actually created genuine hardship. It wasn't just that actually we're offended by our husband looking after our tax. It was actual genuine hardship. Ethel talked about a client that she had. A lady had 6 children, separated from her husband. She couldn't divorce him because it was too expensive to do that, and she was bringing them up on her own. And she had a small income through stocks and shares from which tax was deducted at source. Now she, by rights, under assessment, would have been entitled to that tax back because of the level of her income, but she couldn't claim it. The claim had to be done by her husband. And so even though she was separated, the husband claimed back her tax every year and kept it while she brought up the children. And in fact, if your husband chose not to claim your rebate, you couldn't do anything about it. If he claimed your rebate, you couldn't request it off him. And you were also taxed at the higher rate of, I think, 1 shilling and 2 pence in the pound, but don't hold me to it, instead of 9 pence in the pound, because it was deducted at source and you couldn't get it back. The big case where this all came to a head is the Mark Wilkes case. And this is a picture of Mark and their adopted daughter Helen. Mark and Elizabeth Wilkes were very active in the suffrage movement. So Dr. Elizabeth Wilkes was one of the founder members of the League, and she was also one of the women that put forward the subscription to allow it to be a separate body. Her sister was also very much an active in, her sister was more of a suffragette, Nellie Taylor, and she'd been imprisoned for window smashing in March 1912. And Elizabeth wrote to her and said, the best I can do is tax resistance. She couldn't do a more militant activity. She was a respected professional. She was a doctor in Hackney. She had her own practice. And she also earned significantly more than Mark. He was a London school teacher. And she started resisting her taxes in 1908 and again in 1909. By 1910, of course, the League had been formed and she'd met Athaleas Purdy. And I'm sure that it will have been Ethel that pointed out to her. She was resisting tax requests, bills, assessments that were coming in her name. And Ethel will have pointed out to her, actually, according to section 42 of the Act, those demands should go to your husband because you're not a taxable item. All your income is deemed to be his. So she told the revenue, that's fine, I'm not accepting any more assessments. You can't distrain on my goods anymore. I am not the taxable unit. Assess my husband. So they went to Mark, and Mark went, well, that's all very well, but I've no idea what she earns. Because he had no power to request details of her income from her because the income tax didn't provide that power, because at the time the Act was written, there was no such thing as the Married Women's Property Act. So he was effectively subject to tax on her income, over which he had no control and which he had no income. And this rumbled on back and forth all throughout 1911 until early 1912, when finally they settled on assessing Mark and they decided he owed £37 on Elizabeth's income. And he went, well, I can't pay that. I'm a teacher, I don't have the money. And again, it went back and forth. And then finally, on the 10th of September 1912, they came to arrest him. But he was in bed with a cold. So they came back the following week and they actually arrested him on the 18th of September when he had recovered from his cold. And again, at that point, the League swung into action. They'd been expecting this for some time. They had 600 letters out on the day of his arrest to MPs and other suffrage parties. They enlisted the WSPU because of the connections through Elizabeth's sister. And they organised a procession and they organised protest marches in Trafalgar Square. In the second week of Mark's imprisonment, they also held a protest meeting at Caxton Hall, just not down quite close to where the ATT offices are in Westminster. And George Bernard Shaw came to speak because he'd had a similar issue the year before with super tax. Now, super tax was an additional income tax rate that applied if you earned over £5,000, and it applied to income over £3,000. And he had the same problem. He had a wealthy wife, and his argument was, well, it's all very well assessing me, but I don't know what she earns. And so in 1911, because George Bernard Shaw had written to the Inland Revenue, he'd made a fuss in the Times, they actually changed the legislation for super tax. And if the husband couldn't get the details of the income, then it was possible they permitted the Revenue to make a separate assessment on the wife. But they didn't change it for the likes of Mark, who wasn't in the super tax environment, and so there wasn't a possibility of making a separate assessment on Elizabeth. And they were stuck with this, and they were getting quite a lot of genuine, positive, supportive reporting at the time that he was in jail for a bill that he couldn't pay, and that for an income over which he had no control. And again, Elizabeth petitioned the king, and then finally, after he'd been in prison for 2 weeks, they released him. And again, as was often the case, because the authorities kind of would get so stuck with how to deal with it, they were then left in peace, and then were not pursued for the tax again. So from the perspective of the League, this was a huge success.